Hi there, this is Matt Allington and thank you for joining me for this session. The session today is called Getting the Most Out of Power BI with Excel. Many of you would have come from an Excel background and maybe discovered Power BI along your journey. And what I'm going to show you today is just some of the techniques that I use to get the most out of Excel. You may know of some of these things, but hopefully there'll be some new things here for you today. Let me start off by introducing myself. So as I said, my name's Matt Allington. My background is that I've spent my career working at Coca-Cola. I spent half of my life actually working at Coca-Cola. I worked in sales and also customer service and also in information technology. I now run a BI consulting business here in Sydney, Australia. I do have global reach, so I have customers all around the world, and I do lots of consulting, online training. I also have a fairly active blog, although it's been a little bit quiet the last few weeks. I've also written a few different versions of this one book. My original book was called Learn to Write DAX, and I've updated that book multiple times now, with the latest version being this black version here, Supercharged Power BI, which is now in its third edition. I'm also a Microsoft Power BI MVP. Okay, as far as the agenda for the session today, I'm going to keep it tight and simple. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Analyse and Excel. I would expect that most of you people on this session would know about Analyse and Excel, but I'll show you the different ways that you can leverage Analyse and Excel, and also show you some tricks about how you can use some third-party tools to do Analyse and Excel locally on your desktop PC. Then I'm going to show you another sort of variation of that, where I'm connecting to a Power BI desktop file on my computer, and I'm going to extract some measures from that Power BI desktop file and do some other tips and tricks, which I'll get into shortly. I'm also going to do a pivot table online demo. You may or may not know that this is now possible, but if you have a pivot table and Analyse an Excel pivot table, you can now interact with that live online. So I'll show you that. And then I'm going to show you some cube formulas. And lastly, something a little bit different, how you can extract tabular data from your data models directly into a table inside Excel. So that's the agenda. So let's move on and go to the first demo, which is Analyse in Excel. All right, so here's the first demo. Now let me just briefly show you the data set that I'm using. This is the AdventureWorks database. This is the one that I use with most of my demos. So I have a sales table and I have 4 dimension tables, being calendar, customer, products, and territory. And I've also produced a report here. This is a report that I use for one of my training courses. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to publish this Power BI desktop file to powerbi.com. Now there's a few ways of doing that, as I'm sure you would know, but I'm just going to come here and click publish. Before I do that, let me jump over here. Here is my workspace that I've created. You can use Analyse Excel by publishing to your own personal workspace. So everyone has this personal workspace. But if you're going to do this for the purpose of sharing with other people, I highly recommend that you create a shared workspace, in which case I've created this one called Demo. In order to create this workspace, you will need a pro license, although you can also use Analyse in Excel using a premium workspace as well. So I have my workspace here. It's called Demo. There is nothing in here. So I'm going to come back, and the first thing I'll do is publish my Power BI desktop file, including the report and the data set, and I'll put it here on my demo workspace. It only takes a moment to publish. You could also save the file on your PC, and you could go into the workspace and grab the file and import it from the workspace. That's another way of doing it. So with that done, I'm just going to jump over here now, and I'll just refresh my browser. And over here on the left-hand side, you'll now see the AdventureWorks dataset and also the AdventureWorks report. And if I click on the report, you'll see that it looks identical to the one that I had on Power BI Desktop before. Now, there's actually at least 4 ways that you can do Analyse in Excel. So let me show you those in turn. If you come over here to the report and click on this little overflow menu, you'll see that Analyse in Excel is one of the options. You'll also find that same menu down here next to the data set, Analyse in Excel. You will also find it up here under Export, Analyse in Excel, and in a moment I'll show you where you can find it inside Excel itself. So all three of these effectively do the same thing. So I'll click Analyze in Excel. The first thing that happens is that you get this little XLSX file that is automatically generated and downloaded to your computer. I can navigate to the downloads folder if I like, or I can just open it directly here by clicking open file. And then what will happen is that just like any other Excel file on your computer, when you double click on it, it opens up. There will be some warning messages at the top, and depending on whether you're logged in to your Office 365 account, you may need to sign out or sign in order to make this work. But it's very common that you'll get some of these warning messages. Sometimes there's one, sometimes there's two. Just depends whether you've done this before. So I'm going to click Enable Editing, and then I have a second warning. I'm going to click Enable Content. So after I've clicked both those warnings, notice over here now that I have what appears to be a pivot table. In fact, that's exactly what it is. This is a genuine Excel pivot table. The big difference is that this Excel file contains no data. I'm just going to come up here and go Collapse All. And you'll note here that here are the tables that I referred to when I showed you my data model. So here's the sales table plus my 4-dimension tables. Also notice that I've got this additional table here with a sigma next to it. This is the sales table, and so it appears to be two different copies of the sales table. What happens when you do Analyze in Excel in the way that I'm showing you is that all the measures that are normally stored here in the sales table, so see the measures here, we have a measure for margin, and we have 3 measures here. So there's 4, actually there's one more here. There's 5 measures in total in this sales table. When we use Analyze in Excel, all 5 of those measures appear in this table with the sigma next to it. And then when you come to the sales table, you'll only find the columns. So this is just the way it works with Analyze in Excel. And this is the way it's always worked when you used to connect Excel to SQL Server analysis services back in the old days. So if I come here maybe and bring, say, customer occupation into my table, if I want to look at total sales, note that it's not possible to bring, say, the sales amount column like you can in a traditional pivot table. If you're going to use Analyze in Excel, you must write an explicit measure. So you cannot rely on implicit measures just by dragging a column. So just keep that in mind. And so I need to come up and find my total sales measure. And there we have it, our completely working pivot table, but the workbook contains no data. So let me just show you that quickly. I'll just save this and I'll call this my demo. I'll leave it in the downloads folder. And if I come down to my downloads, here is the demo file. And notice the size of this Excel workbook. It is 17 kilobytes in size. That's despite the fact that my Power BI dataset is, in this case, it's over 2 megabytes in size. So you really start to reap the benefits of Analyze in Excel when you have very large datasets, 200 megabytes and so on. It means that you can have these very thin, performant Excel pivot table workbooks that don't contain any data, let alone the benefit of you having a live connection back to the model. So if I've saved this Excel file now and close it down, and then I could email this file to another person in my organization, they could double click and open the file. When they do that, they will be prompted with these warning messages, and they will be prompted to log in to powerbi.com in order to access the underlying data set. If they do not have access to the underlying data set over here inside Power BI, which is done by coming into the access settings, if they don't have access to this data set at this point, they will not be able to interact with the pivot table in Excel. But keep in mind that anything that is physically on the screen when the Excel file was emailed to them will be visible to the person who opens it. Anything on the screen can be seen, but the end user will not be able to interact with the pivot table unless they have a direct connection to the data set, which means it either needs to be a premium workspace or they must have a Power BI Pro license. And so assuming that they do have those things, you can go ahead and change this pivot table and interact with it. And every time you make a change to the pivot table, a new request is sent to the server. The data is captured and brought back to the Excel workbook. And for this reason, we call these things a thin Excel workbook. Okay, so now you have the concept of Analyse and Excel locked in. I want to show you this thing called a third-party tool. So you notice that I have this menu here, External Tools. And when I click on External Tools, I have three main external tools that I use beyond the scope of the call today, but Tabular Editor, also DAX Studio, and this one that I want to talk about now, which is called Analyse and Excel. Now, what's different about this third-party tool is that I'm running Power BI Desktop on my computer. I do not need to publish this workbook to powerbi.com in order to be able to use Analyse and Excel on my computer. So I just click on this third-party tool and you'll get a similar experience as before. What happens is a new workbook is generated. In this case, you can see the workbook here. And if I come down here, I can make a visual. So perhaps I'll just bring something a little bit different. So I'll bring calendar year and margin. Now, the thing about this particular tool, Analyse and Excel using a third-party tool, is that the direct connection is actually made with the local instance of Power BI Desktop running on my computer. So if I come up here to Data, Queries and Connections, I can right-click and select Properties and go to the definition. This is the connection string that connects Excel to the instance of Power BI Desktop running on my computer. Now, the implication is that if I now come and shut down Power BI Desktop, so let me shut that down. And now, after I've shut that down, I try and change my pivot table. Notice that it doesn't work. And that's because Excel is trying to find the instance of Power BI Desktop running on my computer, but it is no longer running on my computer. All right, so what happens if I build a model and I build a nice pivot table and then I shut down my Power BI Desktop file and I want to reconnect? What do I do? Okay, so what I can do is I can come here and I'll fire up Power BI Desktop. And once I've done that, I'll reopen the same AdventureWorks database that I had open a moment ago. So just let me do that. Okay, so now that I have that Power BI Desktop file open, if I come back and try to interact with my pivot table, I still get an error. So what's going on? Well, the issue is that every time you start Power BI Desktop on your PC, launches at a new location. So there's a new port number that is randomly assigned to Power BI Desktop running on your PC. So it's not as simple as just opening up a new instance of Power BI Desktop with the same backend file and expecting that this local version of Analyse and Excel will work. But there is a workaround, and here's the trick that I tend to use. So if I want to reconnect, remember I want to reconnect this workbook to the Analyse and Excel version running on my computer. So what I do is I come back to External Tools, I launch a new instance of Analyse and Excel. This will create a new Excel spreadsheet with a new connection to Power BI Desktop running on my computer. And then the same way that I did it before, I can come up to Data. In fact, if I just click directly here on Properties, Definition, I can copy this code, Control C. I'm done with that now, I can close it down. And then I'll go back to my other Excel spreadsheet, click on Properties, come to Definition, and simply replace the connection string with the new one which I just generated. And once I've done that, this workbook that I have on my screen is reconnected to the instance of Power BI Desktop running on my PC. And once I've done that, I can now interact with my pivot table again. So just to summarize the key points about Analyse and Excel. So you must have a pro license or a premium workspace. You cannot do Analyse and Excel with a free license. You would typically first publish to a workspace. Typically it would be a shared workspace. And then there are multiple ways that you can connect using Analyse and Excel. And it's also possible to go into Excel directly and fetch a connection from directly within inside Excel. And then there's this other way of doing it using a third-party tool. I've got the link here in the slides. So if you'd like to go to sqlbi.com and navigate to the tools menu, you'll find the Analyse and Excel add-in in there, and it will show you how to install that so that you can connect directly. And then if you do need to make that reconnection using the third-party tools, you can go into data connection and properties to cut and paste the connection string between two different versions. Okay, time for my second demo. This is a bit of an extension to what I just covered with Analyse and Excel, and that will make sense in a moment. So in this example, I'm going to show you how you can extract a list of the measures, the measure dependencies, and some other useful information from your Power BI desktop files running on your computer. This is a tool that I developed. In fact, there are many tools that are available from the community which are very similar in nature but do slightly different things. So let's jump over to Excel and I'll show you what I call my local host workbook. All right, so here I am inside Excel again, and if I come up here to create a new file, notice that I have this personal template folder here, and within the personal template section I have these two versions of what I call my local host workbook. Now when I say local host, what I mean is I'm using this workbook to connect to a version of Power BI desktop running on my computer, basically using a similar approach that was used within that Analyse and Excel third-party add-in. So I'm going to come here. I've got my Power BI AdventureWorks running in the background, so I'm going to click on my workbook here. This template is available. I will provide a link for you in the slides if you'd like to download this workbook. And once you download the workbook, there is this single button here that you click, and after clicking the button, in fact, the way it works is I've written some Power Query queries that goes and analyzes the location of Power BI desktop running on your computer. Once it identifies and finds Power BI desktop, it extracts all the information it needs to do, and then it actually creates that same sort of data connection as we saw in the previous demo. And so this is finished now. Now be aware that there are some common issues. These are all covered on my blog article. I will put a link to the blog in the slides so you can work through this yourself. But once I've done that, notice that I've now got this same pivot table experience over here on the right hand side. So I've got my pivot table, Analyse and Excel pivot table happening using my local host workbook. I'll just quickly create something just to show you that it's working. And so I can go ahead and build that pivot table the same as that third-party tool. But notice there's a few other tabs here that provide some other useful capabilities. The first thing is this memory usage. Now, many of you may have seen this before. It's available inside DAX Studio. It's available from Vertipack Analyzer. And I think I actually did some work, or I copied some work that maybe Casper de Jong did in many years ago to actually produce my version of this. And so this is now a pivot table of the data set inside Power BI. And you can see here that the largest table inside the Power BI dataset is the customers table. And you can use this tool to analyze what is taking up space within your Power BI workbooks. And in case you can see here that the customer key is the biggest column within the data set, but the address line 1 is a very large column as well, as indeed is the date of birth of the customer. And the purpose of this tool is to identify what is taking up space. And if you're not using those columns of data, you can remove those columns from your workbook and it will make your workbook smaller and faster. So that's just a useful tool that you can connect to using the local host workbook. I also have this measures table. Let me just refresh the measures. And so this is another Power Query query. It makes a connection to Power BI Desktop. It grabs a list of all the measures from the query. It's just a couple of buttons to click. And in this case, there's only 5 measures. Now, depending on your integration, if you've got Power Pivot Utilities installed, you can actually click here and run Power Pivot Utilities and format the measures using the DAX formatter plugin, but I don't have that installed at the moment. But what's interesting about this particular view, I call this the measure dependency view, and that is that you can click on any of these measures. So imagine you've got a list of 100 different measures, and we're looking at the margin measure, and you want to know what measures are required to be able to generate margin percentage. And so I can click on the margin percentage and click show inputs. And what it does is it gives me a filtered list of all the measures that are inputs to this margin percentage measure. I can go back and show everything. Or if I wanted to say, for example, show me all the measures that are using the total cost measure, so measures that are dependent on the total cost measure, I could say show referenced, and it gives me a list of the measures that are referencing the total cost measure. So this is just a quick way if you're trying to edit some of your measures and understand what's going on, then this is a pretty useful tool to help you do that. And the rest of these 2 tables are just technical tables, so I won't go into that for this particular demonstration. So in summary, my local host workbook is available for free for download. Here's the link, and what it will allow you to do is create pivot tables. It will give you that insight into what's driving the size of your Power BI workbooks, and you can also extract your measures. Very useful for documentation, but also useful for measure dependencies. Okay, so for my next demo, I'm going to show you how you can use pivot tables online. And when I say pivot tables, I'm talking about a pivot table that is connected at the back end to a Power BI workspace. So extending on the Analyse and Excel principle that I've shown you already. This is a relatively new capability. You may have seen it announced, but let me show you how it works. So I'm going to jump over here. I've got an Excel pivot table set up. This is using the Analyze Excel technique using the same workspace that I had before. I've saved the file on my PC, so I'm going to shut it down now. I should have just shown you that it's working, but I'll jump over here to powerbi.com. I'm going to jump back to my workspace. And if I come over here to my demo workspace, one of the things that you'll notice is that I have this option of having a workbook available within a workspace. So I can come down here and say get data. I'm going to grab a file from my PC. It's a local file. I could also do this from OneDrive or from SharePoint if I wanted to. And I'll just make sure I get the correct one. So this is it here, connecting it from my desktop file. And when I connect to this file, I get an option to either import the data into Power BI, which actually would create a new data model online. In this case, it probably wouldn't even work because there's no data stored inside my Excel file, or I can upload the Excel file. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to upload the Excel file. Notice it's available now within my workspace, and also notice it's available here underneath the workbook section. So if I come here and click on demo, you'll see that it's the same pivot table as before. Notice how we've got Excel Online. So this is effectively Excel Online embedded within powerbi.com. And importantly, I've got the same pivot table experience here. So if I want to do some live interaction with my pivot table, I'm able to just come in here exactly the same as I would if I had this running in Excel on my PC. And I get that same live interactive pivot table experience. There is no data stored in this pivot table. It's stored with a direct connection back to the workspace, which just happens to be the same workspace that I'm in at the moment. My assumption is, I actually haven't tested this, but let me just jump over to my workspace. My assumption is that I'm in my workspace. I should be able to come in here, get that file, local file. I'll grab a second copy of this file. I'll do the same upload as before. I'm in my personal workspace now. Click on this demo workbook. I'll just close this down, and you can see that I've got the same experience as before. And if I bring the manipulation, in this case I bring margin percentage, it works. So as you can see, Excel Online, like this, I can actually embed my pivot table inside a different workspace, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, one more thing I want to show you with this online pivot table experience, and that is that you could actually save the workbook in OneDrive. And so I'm going to do that now. Okay, so here I have a OneDrive folder, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to grab the file, which is currently on my desktop, which is not on OneDrive. And I'll just place it on OneDrive, and I'll just give this a moment to synchronize up into the cloud. And now that it's synced, what I'm going to do is right click and I'll select View Online. This is just a quick way for me to go directly to the online version of OneDrive. Here's the file. You can see I can open up the file. Once I open up the file, I'm in Excel Online. And if I come in and wait for the UI to load, same as before, I can now come down, perhaps that's not a good one, I can come down and I can bring in a new measure. I can put that into my pivot table, or indeed I can do anything that you would normally expect to be able to do with a pivot table, and it's all operating online. And this is a big step forward. This is actually particularly useful if you've got someone that has, say, a Mac PC. They could interact with your pivot tables live using a browser rather than having to try and deal with issues of compatibility, etc. All right, so in summary, once you create your thin workbook pivot table, there's a few things you can do with them. Of course, you can just use them on your local computer, but you can also upload them to powerbi.com in the same workspace as your data set. Indeed, you can upload them to a different workspace. Of course, people will still need to have access to be able to interact with the workbooks, but you can also save the file directly to SharePoint or to OneDrive. And once again, as long as the user accessing the pivot table has access to your Power BI workspace and has the appropriate license, they'll be able to interact with those pivot tables online. Okay, so for the fourth demo I'm going to show you is cube formulas. Now, some of you would be aware of cube formulas. Many of you would not know that these things existed. And in fact, they've been around for years, probably 10 or 12 years. But in many cases, people haven't seen them before because they've never actually had a multi-dimensional cube available with an Excel pivot table to be able to use the concept of cube formulas. I'm not going to go into depth into this topic. I'm just going to create awareness that it exists. And once you know it's there, you can do some further research yourself. Okay, so I'm going to find an Excel workbook. I'm going to go to the one that I just put onto OneDrive. So here it is here. And I'm going to open my workbook. I'll just wait for that to open. And remember that this particular workbook has got a live connection through to powerbi.com. And what that means is that there's actually a multi-dimensional cube. In this case, it's a tabular cube, which is available at the back end as the data provider for this pivot table. In fact, you can see it saying that I'm accessing this online. So there's some multiple user confirmation there. Okay, now once I've connected to this pivot table, I can come up here and go to the pivot table analyze and come to this OLAP tools, and there is this option here called convert to formulas. Now I'll just show you what it does and then we'll go back and talk about it. So once I do this, I get a choice. I'll just leave it as is for now. And what you observe happening on the screen is that the pivot table that I had on the screen has disappeared. And instead, I've got individual formulas that give me the same results as the pivot table. But what's important is because these are individual formulas, you can start to do anything that you want with them. So I can now start to manipulate this workbook a lot more like I would if it was a traditional Excel file. So one of the problems with a pivot table is you lose a lot of the formatting capability that you would normally have with an Excel workbook. But once you convert your pivot tables into what's called cube formulas, and that's because all of these functions start with the word cube. So this one's called cube value. This one here is called cube member, and collectively we call them cube formulas. And so what this does is it uncovers a whole lot of capability to embed Power BI data models and Power BI data sets with your more traditional Excel spreadsheets so that you can extend the capability. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into these cube formulas in any great depth, except to say, firstly, the easiest way to create them is first build a pivot table and then convert that pivot table into cube formulas, but you can actually write them manually and it's not super hard to do. I'll just give you a quick demo. Just keep in mind that this workbook already has a connection to my Power BI data set. So if I want to go and fetch this number here, 29.3 million, what is the total sales for the AdventureWorks database? So I'll go equals cube value. I'm just going to use the IntelliSense. It's asking me for a connection, so I'm going to open quotes, and it tells me that I've got a connection to the AdventureWorks database. So tab and close the quotes, and then comma, and now it's asking me for a member expression. So I'm going to open the quotes. I just have to pause for a moment. I'm going to the measures, so tab, dot, come down to total sales, tab, close quotes, close brackets, enter, and there's the 29.3 million. Okay, so there is a bit of a rhythm to this, so let me just show you again. This time I'll go and grab the total sales of bikes from my AdventureWorks database. So same again, equals cube value, tab, open quote, tab, close the quotes, that's created the connection. Now, what do I want to extract? Well, I want the measures, square brackets, total sales, and now I can put another member expression. In this case, I want the products dot category. There's a little trick here, dot all dot bikes, and I close quotes, and that will go away and fetch for me the total sales of bikes, which you can see is a little bit less than the total sales in the entire database. And once you get into this, the possibilities are frigging enormous. So notice that I have this little connection here, which is connected to the financial year. So one thing I can do is I can come up here and I can actually create a connection to my cube formula down here to this little drop down list. When I click that, and I can come down here and I can select 2018 and notice that my cube formula updates automatically. So the main purpose of this part of the demo was to show you that cube formulas exist, hopefully show you that they're not that hard to write. You will need to do a little bit of research and learning, but this was really about creating awareness, because once you combine cube formulas with Power BI datasets, you've got a great potential to do wonderful things. Okay, so just to summarize on cube formulas have been around for years and years and years, but you may not have ever heard of them before because you must have a multi-dimensional data cube at the back end. So these will not work with a regular pivot table. If you've just got a flat table of data in Excel and you insert a pivot table, this will not work. You must have a data cube at the back end. So typically the way you would do it would be to build a pivot table first. Once you have your pivot table, convert that pivot table to cube formulas by going to the pivot table analyze menu, find the OLAP tools button and convert to formulas. That's the easy way to do it. But once you get the hang of it, it's actually not that hard to write your own cube formulas. Just watch this video again maybe and give it a bit of a practice, and before you know it, you'll be writing your own cube formulas and unleashing a whole lot of capability. Okay, so the last demo I have before I will take questions is talking about tables in Excel. This will just be a quick demo. Once again, there's quite a lot behind this, but let me show you one of the use cases that you might want to do using tables in Excel. Okay, so here I am back in my AdventureWorks database, and if you come over here, you'll notice that I have a customers table, and the customers table has got 18,000 rows. And indeed, these tables can have many thousands of rows, maybe 100,000, even 1,000,000 rows and more. And one of the things that you may know is that it's actually not easy to get more than, I think the number is about 30,000 rows of data out of Power BI into Excel if you wanted to take that sort of tabular data across for some reason. And I'm going to just very quickly build a table. So let's say, for example, I wanted a table containing the customer key, so the customer number, the customer name, their occupation and their total sales. So I'm quickly going to build that as a new table. So I'm going to use DAX as a query language, which is a topic in its own right. And so there are different ways of doing this, but I'm going to write summarize the sales table. I said I want the customer key. I want the customer name. I think I said I want the occupation. And finally, I want total sales. And I'm just going to bring the total sales measure to do that. Now, there's more efficient ways of doing this, so don't beat me up about this particular formula. This is a DAX is a query language function which generates a query, and it creates this table containing 18,484 rows. And you can see here that it's got all of my customers in here with their total sales. Now let's say for the argument that I wanted to put this into Excel. So just to try and make the use case a bit more realistic, maybe I want to bring the phone number in for the customer as well. So the use case might be I want to give my Salesforce a list of customers and their sales so that someone can phone those customers. Here's the list inside Power BI Desktop, but I want this list inside Excel. So how do I do that? Well, of course, you could use the same Analyse and Excel technique that we did before and bring it into a pivot table. But pivot tables aren't always the best way to extract data into Excel. Excel has this other feature called a regular table. So let me show you what I mean. So if I've got a pivot table here, remember I've already got my connection through to, in this case, it's powerbi.com. What I do is I double click on my total sales figure. What Excel and powerbi.com do in conjunction is they send a query to powerbi.com. It grabs all the data that makes up that total sales for that particular year, and it builds a table of data. Now, this is the key point. This is not a pivot table. This is an Excel table, right? It's an Excel table with its own name. Now, in order to do the technique I'm showing you, you must first of all create this pivot table and then double click on one of the cells, which will then generate this Excel table. But now there's a special feature of this Excel table. And this special feature is that it contains a direct connection back to the data model. So if I right click and come down to Table, Edit Query, at the moment, this is actually MDX code that generates and extracts the data that you can see on the screen. But I can replace this code that you can see here, I can replace that with any valid DAX query to generate the table I had before. And so I'm going to come back into here. I'm going to copy this function. So Control C. I'll come back to Excel. Now, because I'm doing this as a DAX query, I must use the evaluate function. And now I'm going to paste my DAX query exactly as the one I had before and click OK. And what happens is that query is re-executed back to powerbi.com and the results are now rendered in a table. And once I've got this in a table, there's the 18,484 rows. And because it's in a table, it's much easier to do the formatting. Indeed, I could come up and set the page layout. So it's sort of like a poor man's paginated report, if you like. You can actually write a DAX query, and then once you've got the query, you can insert it as a table the way I showed you. And that can be a useful way of extracting data, particularly if you've got hundreds of thousands of rows of data. So in summary, you can integrate Excel tables, real traditional Excel tables, with your live Power BI data models. To do that, you must have a data cube on the back end. Powerbi.com is a data cube. You could also use this technique with the localhost workbook or the third-party tool that I've showed you. You first have to create a pivot table and then double click on one of those cells to drill down. That will generate the Excel table with a connection to the data source. Once you have that connection, you can right click, edit the query, and replace the MDX code that is automatically generated with any valid DAX query, remembering you must start with the evaluate keyword, and then you can actually generate that table directly and live within Excel. I do have a blog post if you'd like to learn more about writing DAX as a query language. So here's the link to my blog article. In fact, it's a series of about 3 or 4 different blog articles where I actually take you through the process of understanding how to write DAX as a query language. And when you combine that together with this concept of Excel tables connected to your Power BI desktop files or your Power BI workspace files, you will be able to get this sort of almost like a poor man's paginated report capability once you get all of those skills and bring them together. Okay, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed my session. I'm going to be available for questions, so please hang around and ask me any questions that you'd like.